Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not thyself from my supplication. Attend unto me and hear me. I mourn in my complaint and make a noise because of the voice of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. For they cast iniquity upon me, and in wrath they hate me. My heart is sore pained within me, and the terrors of death are fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling are come upon me, and horror hath overwhelmed me. And I said, Oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then would I fly away and be at rest. Leuven, then would I wander far off and remain in the wilderness, Selah. The word Selah appears 2 times in the psalm to warn the milky expositors that they are dealing with a great deal more than David's personal problems or even the Messiah. The wicked and the enemy of verse 3 are what causes the Jew to flee into the wilderness. See Revelation chapter 12 verse 6 and Hosea chapter 2 verse 14, where he will be fed for 1260 days. Revelation chapter 12 verse 6. Psalm chapter 11 verse 1 was the first mention of the dove, verse 6. The windy storm and tempest of verse 8 are the blast of Isaiah chapter 25 verse 4, and bombs, rockets, lasers and artillery fire. The son of perdition's kings, troops and supporters are in verse 3 as they were found in Psalm chapter 53 verse 4, chapter 44 verse 16 and 36 verse 12. Years ago, an apostate charismatic named Church made a bundle of money by announcing with a startling fanfare that the Psalms were filled with prophetic material on the second coming. He actually missed 80% of the references, but majored in pretending that Psalm 1 was 1901, Psalm 2 was 1902, Psalm 3 was 1903, etc. Thus he had the crucifixion take place in 1922, the marriage of the Lamb 1945, and the Battle of Armageddon in 1936. He built almost as many suckers out of their money as Becker and Swaggart. He later wrote a rehash of 7 publications that had already been published 4 to 20 years before he began to write. One on the Illuminati, one of the Spare of Longinus, one of the Federal Reserve System, one of the CFR, etc. And then built some more suckers they thought they had new material. One ancient divine, Spurgeon's Treasury, says the whole psalm is on the sufferings of Christ. This is an overkill from verses 12 and 13. 1. Give ear, verse 1. 2. Hide not thyself, verse 1. 3. Attend unto me, verse 2. Verse 2 also, as a 4th place, hear me. The prayer requests are self-explanatory. He is complaining, which Christ never did, and is mourning and is afraid, verse 4, which Christ never was. He has pain in his heart. He is trembling for fear, verse 5, which Christ never did, and horror overwhelms him. This is Israel in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, Selah, verse 7. Inspirationally, we may say from verse 2, should God attend to us if we fail to attend to him? In verse 3, they blame him for their own sins. Note the plural terrors in verse 5, fear of the enemy rejoicing, fear of the triumph of falsehood, fear of lingering pain and suffering, fear of being unprepared at the judgment. We may say that troubles have wings like eagles, verse 6. We must pray to outfly them and be at rest. I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and tempest. Destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues, for I have seen violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go about it upon the walls thereof. Mischief also and sorrow are in the midst of it. Wickedness is in the midst thereof. Deceit and guile depart not from her streets. Since Babylon is reigning, Revelation chapter 17 verse 5, the tongues need to be divided as they were at Babel, Genesis chapter 11 verse 7. The psalmist prays for split ranks and a split tongue so that the enemy will be confused, Psalm 53 verse 5. Violence and strife in the city is probably a reference to Revelation chapter 11 verses 1 to 3. When the man of sin enters and takes control, the word divide, segregate, corresponds to 18 different words in the Hebrew language describing the operation. Division is so important in God's sight that it's the basis for salvation, Exodus chapter 12 verse 13. The basis for deliverance, Exodus chapter 11 verse 7. The basis for the ministerial calling, Numbers chapter 8 verse 14. The basis for national prosperity, Deuteronomy chapter 23 verses 1 to 6. The basis for growing crops, Leviticus chapter 19 verse 19. The basis for wearing clothes, Deuteronomy chapter 22 verse 5 and 11. And the basis for eternal judgment, Matthew chapter 25 verse 32, Revelation chapter 20 verse 15. One may say that division or segregation is the perpetual mindset of the supreme sovereign of the universe, whose lifestyle, so-called, is absolute division and schism. The only unity, Ephesians chapter 4 verse 3 and 13, he ever mentions is a unity of born-again, regenerated, Bible-believing people who are outside the religious camp, outside the social camp, outside the ecumenical camp, outside the UN camp, outside the Earth Day camp, Hebrews chapter 13 verses 11 to 13. Their way is called heresy, Acts chapter 24 verse 14, because it's anti-intellectual, anti-Catholic, anti-one world, anti-sin, anti-philosophy, anti-science, and so on. And anti-religious. It's an anti-social, so-called hate group, bent on destroying every effort of unsaved men to get together, Genesis chapter 11 verse 4, and when they finally get together, the Lord burns them, Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 8, Matthew chapter 13 verses 38 to 40. How is that for apartheid, so-called? Jerusalem in the tribulation is so filled with mischief, sorrow, wickedness, deceit, and guile, verses 10 to 11, that spiritually it's called Sodom and Egypt, Revelation chapter 11 verse 8. All of the commentators miss all of the references. They are all so busy using older and better manuscripts or the wealth of material discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls that all they can do is change give ear to listen, NIV, prayer to pleading, NEB, hear me to bend down thine ear, Baitken, is sore pained to writhed, bricks and dumb, divide their tongues to confuse their tongues, RSV, wilderness to far off deserts, the Donald Duck Bible, the Living Bible, and make a noise, to moan, noisily, New King Jimmy Bible, Jimmy Version. Thus they miss all the biblical revelations found in the AV text of 1611. The corrupt AD Septuagint, written more than 100 years after that crucifixion, has erased the word Selah from all the verses and written pause in accordance with the best private interpretation of the so-called Alexandrian cult.